Psalm 14. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. 1. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is none that doeth good. 2. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. 3. They are all gone aside. They are altogether become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. 4. Have all the workers of iniquity no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread and call not upon the Lord. 5. There were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous. 6. You have shamed the counsel of the poor, because the Lord is his refuge. 7. Oh, that the salvation of Israel were come out of Zion, when the Lord bringeth back the captivity of his people. Jacob shall rejoice, and Israel shall be glad. This is a reasonably short psalm, so let me read the Jerusalem Bible version to give you the flavor of a modern translation. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Their deeds are corrupt and vile. There is not one good man left. Yahweh is looking down from heaven at the sons of men to see if a single one is wise, if a single one is seeking God. All have turned aside, all alike are tainted. There is not one good man left, not a single one. Are they so ignorant, all these evil men who swallow my people? As though they were eating bread and never invoke Yahweh. They will be struck with fear without reason, since God takes the side of the virtuous. Deride as you may the poor man's hopes. Yahweh is a shelter. Who will bring Israel salvation from Zion, when Yahweh brings his people home? What joy for Jacob, what happiness for Israel. Same psalm, but somehow in the modern version it's got a different feel. One of the images that comes out immediately in this psalm is the image of the fool. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now, this is an archetypal image, and it's part of a pair of opposites, the fool and the wise one. But it sometimes happens, as with all opposites, that a figure wearing the clothing of one is actually doing service for the totality. Just as the wise one often embodies the self, so too the archetypal image of the fool can sometimes embody wholeness. In this respect, the fool is connected to the image of the divine child. The figure of Persephone in the Grail legend is an example. Even though his mother dresses him in an imaginatively uncouth costume, so that at court he will cut the figure of a gawky boorish fool, he is described as a pure fool through pity wise, and becomes the redeemer of the ailing Grail kingdom. So just because a figure wears the garments of folly or of wisdom doesn't necessarily mean that it stands for only one side of a pair of opposites. Symbolism is fluid in that respect, and one must always interpret a given image in terms of the context in which it appears. In the context of Psalm 14, for instance, it is clear that the image of the fool is used as only one side of the pair. Many biblical passages are very hard on fools. Here are a few examples. Let a bear robbed of her whelps meet a man rather than a fool in his folly. As a dog returneth to his vomit, so a fool returneth to his folly. Wisdom excelleth folly, as far as light excelleth darkness. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. Proverbs especially does not like fools. But on the other hand, we have Christ saying, whosoever shall say thou fool shall be in danger of hellfire. And there's also Paul's great passage on wisdom and foolishness, which is psychologically relevant. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and will bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified unto the Jews, a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness. But unto them which are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. And base things of the world and things which are despised hath God chosen, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. Man's wisdom is God's foolishness, and man's foolishness is God's wisdom. In this passage, it's a matter of anatiodromia. One side of a pair of opposites can reverse and turn into its contrary. You see, the ego, insofar as it sets itself up against the self, is submitting to foolishness. And yet, for the modern mind, it is a necessary foolishness because it corresponds to the necessary crime upon which ego development is based. We will come back to this later. There's another very interesting feature to this psalm. Verse 5 reads, "There were they in great fear, for God is in the generation of the righteous." The Jerusalem translation reads, "They will be stuck with fear without reason, since God takes the side of the virtuous." The Douay version, the English translation of the Vulgate reads, "They have not called upon the Lord, there have they trembled for fear, where there was no fear." This passage is important psychologically and is reminiscent of a passage in Deuteronomy 28. Here Moses is speaking to the disobedient children of Israel. "For not obeying the voice of Yahweh your God, just as Yahweh took delight in giving you prosperity and increase, so now he will take delight in bringing you ruin and destruction. You will be torn from the land which you are entering to make your own. Yahweh will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will serve other gods of wood and of stone that neither you nor your fathers have known. Among these nations there will be no repose for you, no rest for the sole of your foot. Yahweh will give you a quaking heart, weary eyes, halting breath. Your life from the outset will be a burden to you, night and day. You will go in fear, uncertain of your life. In the morning you will say, 'How I wish it were evening,' and in the evening, 'How I wish it were morning.' Such terror will grip your heart, such sights your eyes will see." And again in Leviticus, "And if in spite of this you do not listen to me, but set yourselves against me, I will set myself against you in fury, and punish you sevenfold for your sins. I will strike fear into the hearts of those of you that are left. In the land of their enemies, the sound of a falling leaf shall send them fleeing as men flee from the sword, and they shall fall, though there is no one pursuing them. Just as they will be struck with fear without reason." These passages all belong to the psychology of phobias, fears without apparent reason, anxiety attacks, flight when no one is pursuing you. If we look for the archetypal basis of phobic symptoms, we will generally find the picture that's described in these passages from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Yahweh will give you a quaking heart, weary eyes, halting breath. In other words, the victim of phobia has been given a quaking heart, not by an external danger, but by the inner complex whose archetypal core is the self. Now that's not how it first looks when one starts to analyze such a case. At first, it usually looks as if the phobia comes from some traumatic childhood experience. Perhaps the person was terrorized by a violent father as a child. If one is satisfied with that personalistic level of interpretation, then that's as far as the issue will go. The childhood experience will continue to repeat itself in adult life, and one will circle endlessly around it. But the problem is never really settled on the personal childhood level. It gets settled only when the dreams lead to the underlying archetypal level of what's expressed here in the statement that Yahweh is giving the person a quaking heart. It may be true that originally the father gave the child a quaking heart, but that's not the root of the matter. At the core of the childhood experience is just a particular example of the universal archetypal experience of man's relation to Yahweh, the ego's relation to the self. The child happened to encounter that wrathful aspect prematurely, precociously. It's too much for a child to have an encounter so much so soon, but reality isn't nice about such things. Too often it happens whether or not the person is ready for it. The root of the problem is not the father. The root of the problem is Yahweh, or psychologically the self. As I have written elsewhere, behind apparent problem will lurk the dynamism of the self, All problems of alienation are ultimately alienation between ego and self, and these biblical references illustrate and amplify that fact. Finally, Psalm 14 is used as a proof text for the doctrine of original sin. It says explicitly in verse 2 and 3 that there's not a single person on earth who isn't sinful. The Lord looked down from heaven upon the children of men to see if there were any that did understand and seek God. They are all gone aside, they are all together become filthy. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Well, that's about as total as one can get, and therefore, I'd say that's a pretty good text for original sin. Paul quotes this passage in Romans 3:12, and Paul is the fountainhead of the Christian doctrine of original sin. There are also other references in the Psalms that say the same thing. For example, in Psalm 143, verse 2, we read that, "In thy sight shall no man living be justified." Understood psychologically, these are not matters of theoretical or doctrinal dispute. The psychological approach transcends all those matters because it penetrates to the psychic facts underlying all doctrines. In this particular case, the psychological fact is that individual existence, based on the development of an individual ego consciousness, is a crime. According to whom? According to what? Well, it is a crime according to the nature of the psyche. The unconscious describes it as a crime, and the religious and mythological material simply illustrate how the unconscious psyche speaks of the emergence of the ego. Ego consciousness presumes to exist as an autonomous center of being. Consciousness could not come into being if the individual ego did not make that assumption. In order to exist at all, it is obliged to set itself up against the unconscious from which it has been born. It takes that energy of the instincts belonging to the natural psyche, the energies of desire, of pleasure, of power, and appropriates them to itself. And those energies then go to build up ego existence as a separate center of being. What's more, all civilized societies must support the assumption that the ego is autonomous, and so as individuals, we are treated as though we are each completely responsible for all our actions. Ridiculous, of course. We are doing things all the time without any notion of where they come from or why. But society is constructed to support individual consciousness, and thereby it promotes the original crime. The ego's claim to be an autonomous center of being, that symbolically is the rebellion of Lucifer, the son of the morning. It is the dawn of the ego. It is the original sin and applies to everybody, because it occurs contrary to the original state of things. Ego existence is by nature guilt-laden. It is not possible to live a guilt-free life and have any degree of consciousness. They go together. All that is implicit in the imagery of this psalm.